Fragments of Silicon. Um, Ad-libbing off the top because people aren't here today. All right, welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon. Apologies that that Golix isn't here today. We just got informed that he has to go and do an oil change. That's been badly needed. I think he's talked about that, in his news updates, and he kind of forgot about it until today, and just got the message a few minutes ago that he wasn't going to be able to do his duties today, so wasn't going to get a lot of wit out of a few minutes of spontaneity. But that aside, welcome to another European interview edition of Fragments of Silicon. Joining us this week is Thomas Rowlings of Auroch Digital.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, good. Exactly sure how to pronounce Auroch there, but good to know that we got it right. Anyway, so how we like to start things. We like to get to know the person behind the game, the studio, and whatnot. And we do that by asking them, what got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level?
Okay, well, I've been making games for a very long time, so I have to say I'm very old school in this. So the first thing that got me interested in games overall, if you like gaming culture, was probably starting to play D&D. That was a real revelation when I was a kid, that there was this whole other world you could get into. That was amazing. And from there, I got into like Warhammer 40k and games like Ogre and stuff like that. But on the computer side of it, I started playing computers in the really, really early days. So over here in the UK, there was a famous game system called the Spectrum. And I started playing on a computer called a ZX81. Which was notable because it had a pretty astounding amount of RAM. It had 16K of RAM, which you could, and back then, use to type your own games into it. And so, starting to learn to mess around with code and making stuff really early on. And so that, again, sparked my interest. Was not only could you play these things, but you can make them. And that started my interest. And then, I ended up, many years later, I ended up getting an opportunity to become a kind of assistant game designer at a company who just needed somebody temporarily. I took a hiatus from the thing I was doing then. But it's something I'd always wanted to do. So, I just, this is where I wanted to be. So I kind of grabbed that opportunity with both hands, took it and never looked back. And here I am sort of 20 plus years later, still making video games.
And where did you first start in the industry?
So the first company I worked at was a company called Hot House Creations. They don't exist anymore. A lot of games companies don't exist anymore, so that's not uncommon. The games they're probably notable for making was they made a game called Gangsters, which was a kind of like strategy game where you ran a gang. That did quite well. I didn't work on that, but I worked on a game called Abomination, the Nemesis Project, which you can find on Wikipedia, which was an attempt to make a kind of real-time version of XCOM. So that was the first game I worked on. And then from there, I moved on to a company called Pivotal Games. I worked on the Conflict Desert Storm series of games, which was a whole series of them, on PlayStation 2 predominantly, which was a very popular and successful series. And then I left there to start doing my own thing. So founded another company, worked on some games with Sony, who published them, and then left that company to, sold my stake in that company to found Auroch Digital. And this year we celebrate 10 years as a company. So yeah, very exciting year for us.
Oh, that's good. And how big is Auroch Digital?
So at the moment we have about 20 members of staff. So we're a sort of reasonably sized indie. I think if you what was fascinating is looking at the there was the survey recently of companies that went to GDC last year, and they were asking how big are you, and the two most popular answers as to how big companies were one person or 500 plus. And I was trying to think, is there another industry that can be so polarized to exist either as like, you know, a little one-person outfit or huge companies? So actually, we're a kind of a reasonably sized indie, I would say.
I'm like, music industry comes to mind. At least
yeah, actually, yeah, of course, yeah. I bet there's loads of like one-people outfits, just a singer or a good point.
Yeah. I mean, kind of the same way too. Like, you know, you have your really small micro indies who can release stuff to like SoundCloud, and you know, people who work at the big labels.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so what was your first project with Auroch Digital?
So Auroch Digital actually started out as a consultancy on games. So we were helping out with other companies and doing a variety of stuff. We ran a project for a bit called Game the News, turning news and current events into games, where we worked with people like Wired. The first proper release game, for want of a better term, was a port of an old Games Workshop game called Chainsaw Warrior, which I used to play as a kid. Loved the game. Ended up getting in touch with Games Workshop just as they had come out of I think they'd had a big deal with THQ. And then when THQ went under, that deal, which was a kind of all-encompassing like deal, that they changed their strategy to say, well, actually, we're going to work with a range of companies, and right. We were one of the range of companies they worked with. So for us, that was a great game. It was a real door opener. It's not a massive title, you know, the original. That was a labor of love, like just a game I wanted to do. Very proud of it. It's you know, it's been a great little title for us. But yeah, that was of what we are now. That was the sort of first major one.
Right. And what was it like to work with Games Workshop directly?
Well, last year we finished our third title with them, so we've been working with them for a while. Games Workshop, I really enjoy working with them. What's amazing is they really are a company of people who love Games Workshop. Every person at Games Workshop I've worked with has been a passionate fan of the stuff. So, you know, I've never met anyone who works at Games Workshop who's just there for the money. Like, they do it because they love it. And it's a really impressive operation of people who care deeply about the games they make. So I'm also a big fan of Games Workshop stuff. I love the universes they create. I love the games they make. So it's like shared nerdery. So whenever we have a social event or something like that, and of developers and Games Workshop developers, it always turns into a massive nerd chat about Space Marines and Warhammer Fantasy and various board games they made back in the 80s and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's very enjoyable, and I hope we do more.
Well, what was your last game with them then?
So the game we did with them last year is called Dark Future, Blood Red States. So that's on Steam now. That was an old board game I played as a kid. You're seeing a pattern here. And I sort of said, are you doing anything with it? And they're like, no, like we really didn't expect anyone to want to do something with it. So I said, well, can we make a reboot of that? And they were like, yeah, okay, let's do that. We put together a proposal. They liked it, and we went ahead and made that game. So that came out last year. I think amongst the things in there that I'm really proud of what the team's done with it is we created a hybrid of turn-based strategy and real time. So the game plays out in real time, but you slow time down to whatever speed you want it to be, to a crawl. You give your vehicles your orders, and then you speed time up. So the original of Dark Future was a board game where you have cars fighting each other. So it's like a car combat game. And in the board game version, like the road was in these kind of tiles that you laid out, and then you each had turns in which you'd kind of do handling and movement on your car. We took the spirit of that, but we basically reinvented it, because one of the things obviously video games do really well is they are a simulation of a vehicle. So if you wanted to do a board game which simulates cars moving and playing around, then the more accurate you make that simulation, the less fun it is to play, because you need a high education in maths to figure out all the velocity and turning circle and all that kind of complicated stuff. whereas a computer can handle all of those calculations for you. So we built the game in Unreal. So Unreal is doing all the hard physical work. In fact, in our game, our game actually does the driving for you. So it's not a driving game. It's a strategy game where you're controlling cars and telling them who to shoot and who to ram into and who to slow down and when to brake. So you're giving them the overall orders and they're following it. They're carrying them out. So yeah, very proud of that game. And yeah, it's we've had a very good reception of players for it. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Now, in mentioning that overall philosophy, the next question applied. Did you take that mindset and apply it to the game that we're going to be talking about here, Mars Horizon?
In some respects, like Mars Horizon is a distillation of a lot of stuff that we've been working on, a lot of stuff that I'm personally interested in. I suppose a lot of the games we end up making have a kind of strong personal connection in that they're things I like or things I care about. And of course, it's much easier, it's certainly not impossible as a games designer to make games about things you're less interested in. But of course, it's easier if you are into it. That helps you to drive you further and better in what you're doing. And Mars Horizon, like I've always been interested in space and space exploration. And a few years ago, I'd sort of read, there was a biography came out of Elon Musk, which I read. And I was reading that at the same time, read the book of The Martian and then watched the film. And all of that stuff was sort of spinning around in my head about this. And of course, space exploration's at a really exciting stage now where some really interesting stuff's happening. And so, yeah, the next natural step of that, because I'm a games designer, is to express that interest through a game. And I didn't just want to make a game that was, like I'm a fan of Kerbal Space Program, for example, amazing games. They've done fantastic stuff. We didn't want to do that because that's already been done really well. But also I didn't want to make a game where you're like piloting a space shuttle around, because that's not what we had in mind. I'm very into strategy games, really enjoy strategy games. So I wanted to make a game that captured that awe and wonder and interest in space exploration and the challenge of it. So what we ended up doing is coming up with the idea of a game which is basically in two parts. Part of it is closer to a kind of tycoon builder game that you might have seen, in that you're building your base is your agency. So you're building up your agency, you're staffing it up, you're setting its goals. So you're running a space agency. You're taking those decisions on what missions you're going to do, what missions you're not going to do. You get requests to do missions, which again is sort of how it happens in reality. And you pick the things you can do and not. And then based on the success of your agency, the government will give you more or less money. And then you spend that money sort of doing stuff. Then the other part of it is then you obviously design the rockets. And again, we've used a more modular approach to that. So we're not doing the full physics things that Kerbal does, deliberately again. And interestingly, chatting with somebody from the European Space Agency, and we were talking about that, and they said, yeah, that modular approach to rocket building is actually quite common. You don't necessarily reinvent the wheel every time you make a rocket. So, we sort of took that approach as part of it. And then the other big thing that I'd say that's quite different is the mission control. So once the mission's on, that we want the player to have that sense of the excitement, the danger, the options of being in mission control, where you're faced with some difficult choices sometimes. Do you abort a mission? Do you push it? Do you, do a risk like shut down a critical system in the hope that you can divert the power somewhere else and get something done, but risk your astronauts? Or do you not want to take those risks? Because again, as in real space exploration, every choice you make is a risk. You're risking, somebody's life. You're risking, but you're also risking your agency. And all those things get balanced out. And again, from the research we've done, those are real choices that people running missions take, and we wanted to give the player some of that. So Mars Horizon distills that interest in space and space exploration, that excitement of where it is now and where it's going to be over the next few years, hopefully, and also our interest in science and technology and engineering and wanting that sense of realism to it. So there's no warp drives, there's no teleporters, nothing wrong with those. They are science fiction fodder for other things. But everything in our game either did exist, was built in prototype, was at least planned in reality. So, for example, the USSR, when Russia was the Soviet Union or part of the Soviet Union, they planned their own version of the space shuttle, and you can Google it, called the Buran. And it's a fantastic looking vehicle. They built a couple of prototypes but they never really got that far with it. Or, for example, the Russians planned their own moon landing. They built a moon lander ready for that, but again, it never really panned out. So the idea of our game is, well, maybe things will work out differently. Maybe the first person on the moon is a Russian, but maybe the first person in space is from NASA. Maybe the first person to do a spacewalk is from the European Space Agency, and that's kind of down to you as the player to kind of push your luck or not, and take the various strategic and tactical choices about how you're going to advance your agency. But of course, the main goal and the title of the game, Mars Horizon, is to be the first agency to complete a crewed mission to Mars. So you've got to get people to Mars, and you've got to get them back again. And if you can do that, you win.
Right. And let's see, lots to unpack here. I suppose, first of all, in terms of factions, it sounds like you've got 3 of them. The USSR, NASA, and the European Space Agency.
Yeah.
And, there's some interesting, history in there as well. What sorts of rockets would the European Space Agency have used, during the space race?
Well, so in our game, so, for example, the European Space Agency has a whole, stable of rockets that it uses. So the Ariane 5 is probably the most iconic and the one lots of people have seen, which is its equivalent of like a workhorse rocket. But over the years, they've used different sorts. And also because the European Space Agency is composed of the member nations, a lot of who originally had their own space agencies, then some of their technology got folded into what the European Space Agency is doing. So yeah, we've got 3 main playable factions in the game, which are ESA, which is the European Space Agency, we've got NASA, and we've got Russia. And each of those has a few of their own vehicles, they have a few of their own missions and things. But there's also a lot of reuse of rockets between that, kind of generic technologies, which again, you do find in space. Ideas get, if it works, great, they get reused. And I think a lot of those designs are so solidly built, and they've undergone such rigorous testing and design to be built in the first place that, often decades later, they're still using the same designs for things, because if it works, it works. We also are going to add into the game the ability to found your own space agency. So yeah, if somebody really wanted to play, the Brazilian Space Agency or something like that, then they can create that agency and, sort of take it their own direction. If the game does well, and obviously we've got a lot of confidence in it, I would love to see us adding more and more national agencies into that with particular technologies and missions that are unique to that agency. So I think that's an exciting potential for it. But also I'd love to see people to create their own slightly odd agencies. So maybe you get like the Michigan Space Agency or the Texas Space Agency. Maybe they decided in your version of history not to throw it all in with the US and do their own thing anyway. Or maybe your own hometown forms of space agency. So yeah, it will be interesting to see what players do with that.
Now, also in terms of past technologies, we've touched a bit upon it, but will you be able to launch, say, the Saturn V rocket, or the space shuttle, the very iconic space faring vehicles of the past?
Yeah, so the shuttle's in there as a kind of NASA-only vehicle that you can access. So you can design, go through all the various prototyping design you need to design and build that vehicle and then launch it. In terms of the overall, the way the rockets are done in the game is they're built modular, so like upper and lower stage boosters, things like that. But if you put together the right pieces, that would be a Saturn V, and you can call it Saturn V, or you can mix it up a bit and give it your own names.
Okay. And we've been talking a lot about rockets, and they're not the only space object that exists. Will you be able to launch satellites and space stations?
So the way the game works with that sort of stuff is, yes, you build the sort of modules, we call them. So you build the modules, the thing you're trying to do. So if you're trying to put up a satellite or something like that, then you'll build the modules a part of that. The modules they come with a series of, for want of a better term, technologies in there that then impact how you do the mission during the mission control, and that gives the player a chance to express some of their different style of gameplay. Are they going to put in loads of redundancy systems, or are they going to do it all super lean but risky? once you've kind of built your modules, the main thing you design and build then is the rockets to get it up there, because obviously that's one of the most iconic and interesting parts of space exploration is the actual getting of stuff around. So there's a lot of focus on that. And then there's two essential ways the game pushes you to act. Is one, you've got what we call the milestone missions. So these are the really big key things, like first person to do a spacewalk, first person in space, first person on the moon. They obviously come with a lot of kudos if you achieve them. But of course, the first time you're going to do it, it's harder because you're breaking new ground. In addition to that, then you will get what we call request missions. So your national government or private companies will come to you and say, well, can you launch a satellite? Can you investigate the moon, Europa? And then you'll decide whether or not you do that. And again, having been to the European Space Agency and chatted with some of the people involved in how they organize mission planning, it's very much done like that. So the scientists in Europe will be, well, we would really like to understand this phenomena. And we need a satellite in the orbit of that planet to do it. And then they'll sit, they took us through exactly how to do it in the process. We get a whole bunch of people in a room, scientists, engineers, sort of mission planners, and they go, right, so let's talk about a real one that they're doing, the ExoMars mission, which goes up next year. They want to sample the gases in the atmosphere of Mars. So they're like, well, we need various things that allow us to do that. We need instruments. So then that's the module. You're designing the thing we want to put into orbit around Mars. Well, then the second part of that is, okay, now we've designed that thing and we know how big it is and what power supply it needs, and we've got to get it there. So now we know the size of the thing. We've got to determine a rocket that's powerful enough to get it out of the gravity of Earth and get it, several million miles across space to where it needs to be. And then when it gets there, we've got to get it there intact so it works. So that's kind of like, again, that the two approaches: the players either directing stuff or the players getting requests from its government or from other agencies to do stuff.
Okay. And now in terms of future tech, let's say, because, we have obviously not gone to Mars yet. How are you implementing this into the systems? Like basically, how much is this still existing, in reality, and how much is just pure theoretical?
So all of the stuff that you can build to get to Mars, it is theoretical, but it is, like I say, they're real stuff that agencies are planning on doing it. So it's not us just thinking, cool, let's come up with some crazy process to do it. Let's, actually we've looked at the published research of scientists and engineers about how you're going to get to Mars, and we've used that as the basis. So I'll give a good example, and again related to a real one. So the ExoMars mission that's going to go up is putting a rover called the Rosalind Franklin onto Mars. And the big thing that will have above the other rovers that have been done, the next advance in knowledge, is it's got a big drill that will drill under the surface of Mars to about a meter or so down, so that it can take much deeper core samples than have been possible to date. And I believe, if I understand right, what they're planning on doing then is it will gather samples of rock and it will leave those samples in special carriers. And then in theory, then the next thing is to do the sample return. So, and this is obviously a good test for getting people to Mars. It's a lot easier because you don't need oxygen, life support. Bits of rock from Mars are a lot more robust, but it does test a whole bunch of the tech you need to send something to the surface of Mars and then bring things back from Mars. Because obviously in our game, you've not just got to get people to Mars, you've got to get them back. Because I suppose the cheating way, if you just got to get them there, is you can take a corpse and fire it to Mars, and as soon as it lands there, say, hey, look, I've got people on Mars. But obviously that's not what we're wanting. We're wanting you to get people there and back. Because I think for me, the thing I found very inspiring with reading Elon Musk's biography was this big thing around the idea of making humanity a multiplanetary species. And of course, the first step to that really is people being able to live on Mars, which the first step to that is we've got to get somebody to Mars. And that's the nice thing. If you've seen the film or read the book The Martian, there's a great scene in it where he realizes he's the first Martian, because there's some definition of how do you define somebody as being a people of a place. And there's a definition he's looked at, which is once you've grown food there, you are of that. You can call yourself of that place. And not spoiling the film, but he figures out he's got to grow food, and so he starts growing potatoes in Mars. And of course, as soon as he crops his first bunch of potatoes, he's now a Martian. He's the first person on Mars. So again, that kind of exciting journey is the thing we really want to show, some of the first important steps, but also to underline just how complicated and big those steps are.
Right. And now shifting over to the agency aspect of the game, like how in depth is that? Like, do you have to manage all of your expenses? Do you have to like generate profits? Like how close to like an actual tycoon game is that segment of the game?
Yeah, there's definitely like. I think we've got the right balance. We didn't want it to be just an overly tycoon game, because without the agency aspects of it, where you could be managing anything, and we didn't want that sense. We want the sense it is a proper space agency. So you ultimately, your agency gets money from, the government gives you money. The government is interested in big prestigious stuff. They're interested in stuff that the people like, because if you're getting your money from ultimately people vote in a government, and that government has priorities, and if those priorities include space exploration, then they're going to give you money, which is good. So that's part of it, but also request missions where you're asked to put up a satellite, then you can earn money from that as well. So there's different ways you can get money, and then of course there's different ways you can spend that money. You can spend that money with buildings, you can spend that money on building rockets. So for example, if you're going to build a rocket, you can build a couple of them, so you've got one in spare, and then if something goes wrong, you can substitute that in, and you make sure a mission keeps on pace. There's a sense of a tycoon-ness game there, but it's in the service of the missions. And I think that's the key thing, is you don't build a base for the sake of having a big base. You build a big base because all of those functions allow you to launch ever more complicated, interesting, and deeper missions into space. Right.
And does that aspect change via the agency? Like, for example, the USSR was a communist country, and they handled monetary systems differently than the USA. Is that a factor in anything?
Yeah, so we're making we're still in the process of doing this. We're going to make all the agencies play a bit differently. So, and that difference should be reflected in what that agency is. So, for example, if you're playing with ESA, it's probably a good example. I know a lot more about that, how we're going to make that work. ESA is an organization with I think it's 22 member countries and a bunch of associate member countries. So one of the things they're really good at is diplomacy. You have to be if you've got so many different countries under your umbrella. And so in the game, you can actually reach out to the other agencies and offer to do joint missions, or they can reach out to you. And so the game always has this cooperative, competitive element. So, of course, there's the kudos of being the first person in space, or the first person on the moon, or the first to get a satellite, into orbit on Phobos or something like that. But if you share that with another agency, you share the kudos a bit. It's maybe slightly less impressive if you've done it, as a shared thing. Although I would say more impressive in another way. But you gain a lot by working with other organizations, and if you're ESA, then that kind of diplomacy and shared missions is a bit more effective than maybe with other agencies who are a bit less used to it. So yeah, I think by the end of it, what I really hope is players try all the different agencies out, partly because they've got their own cool vehicles and missions, but partly as well because they'll have a different play experience each time.
Right. And another metric that I don't think we've touched upon quite yet is time. Now, obviously, you're competing, agencies, but is there a certain amount of time that you need to get to Mars?
Yeah, so there's set amounts of time, which obviously how long it takes to get to Mars is partly a function of exactly what you're using to get there. But yeah, there are also windows which are key. So as Mars and Earth orbit around the sun, you arrive at points where they're closer, and really they're the launch windows you've got to use. And that's a pretty key part of it, which is there's a big calendar function within the game where you schedule up your missions. and there's essentially a couple of competing mechanics going on there. One is, well, the more time elapses between you deciding on your mission and when you're going to launch it, in general, the better the mission's going to go, because the more time people have to prepare. But the flip side of that is the more time you leave it before you do a mission, the more likely it is somebody else, another agency, will get in there first. In addition, it isn't open-ended. As I say, there are launch windows that you have to adhere to for different missions. So the exact times you work, you kind of have to work around the reality of the solar system. And so I think those competing different mechanics give the player some interesting choices in where they schedule it up. And that's, again, one of these functions of running an agency that I think are really interesting is what are you going to prioritize? What are your priorities? I hope that the player will arrive at interesting choices they have to make about maybe not taking a request mission or even canceling a mission because there's a better opportunity or there's a kind of window they really want to go for. And I think what I really like the idea is that, you could basically just be laser focused on getting to Mars and you cut away everything else but that. But if you do that, your agency doesn't build, and you don't build that kind of wealth of experience in doing it. So it's possible, it's just much riskier. Whereas if you take things a bit slower and you're a bit more, you spend more time figuring stuff out, the chances of success, especially for each individual mission, go up. But you're not necessarily going to be the first person to do that unless all the other people trying to get there first are super unlucky.
And does that apply to, like, how do I put this, the greater scope of things? That is to say, do you have only like a decade to get to the moon?
No, we give you the game will run as long as you want to run. And again, this is happening in reality. There's nothing, I think, was it China recently put a rover onto the moon, a robotic rover onto the dark side of the moon or something, but it's up to people how they want to do it. So we don't restrict it in that, but you probably won't be first if you're going to take ages.
And now we've talked a lot about what's in the game, but what is the state of the game itself? Where is it in development?
So right now we are 3 days away from a beta, which people can sign up to if they go to aurochdigital.com. They'll see a little box there, click on that, stick your email in, and we will send you a beta code. That's going to be run on Steam. So the beta is going to focus really on the build up on the mission to the moon. So it's part of the game. And from that, obviously, we're hoping to get a bunch of feedback from players on what they like, what they don't like, and then modify that. And then our plan at the moment, I say at the moment, and being super vague, is to release later this year. The reason I'm being super vague is obviously, if we get a bunch of feedback, that's great ideas or there's things we really need to work on. I don't want to fix us into a hard release time for that. I want the game to be what the game should be. I think there's a quote somebody said, isn't there, that what is it? It's a game released in a rush is always a rushed game, but a game released late can be. No, I'm mangling the quote, but the point being that I'd rather release a game that took longer to do it, but it is the game we wanted people to play, than we rush a game out to get a thing out there and it isn't where we feel it should be. There's a lot of time and energy and love and passion has gone into this game, so it's got to be right for when it comes out.
I see what you're saying, especially since this game is dealing with a lot of complex stuff. I mean, it's not obviously Kerbal levels of complicated, but it's still fairly complicated.
Oh yeah, and again, very consciously we're not doing what Kerbal do, and I think that's a really key thing. What we've noticed is there's definitely an overlap in fans of people who've signed up to our thing and who've chatted with us on social media or whatever. There's definitely a lot of Kerbal fans who are signing up to the beta, and we welcome them. That's great. But we do a different thing to what Kerbal does. What I think it is complementary. Like, I think if you play Kerbal and play our game, the main common thing will be the theme of space, but beyond that you'll get very different game experiences, which is good because then you get to experience space gaming in two very different areas. Right.
And have you determined if you're going to do you're going to do a beta, but are you going to launch in early access first?
No, that's not currently the plan. Our plan is to basically go for launch, and our plan really is to launch on all platforms, so console, PC, at the same time is our current plan. But I would say, I think being a company that's making plans at the moment is complicated, given the coronavirus situation has just thrown everything up in the air. So, we were planning on coming out to the US at GDC, looking forward to that. And obviously that never happened. The other big games event for us, it would be Gamescom in Cologne in Germany in August. That's also off. So yeah, I think it's kind of hard planning to release a game, because a bunch of these events, which are for us quite important, because we get to put the game in front of journalists and get them to have a play in it. We get to meet with platform holders and chat with them about stuff. So there's a lot of logistics on the kind of the business, the marketing, and the promotion side of a game that go into releasing a game. So it's kind of important, to give the game the best chance of success it has. Ideally, you want to have all those conversations with all those people, and we just don't know how that's going to pan out. And so that's another big unknown that we're dealing with in terms of making the game. The development side of stuff's proceeding, pretty well. The team have adapted to work from home incredibly well, and production sort of firing on all cylinders. But the other side of it's a big unknown at the moment. I just don't know how that stuff's going to pan out.
I don't think anyone does.
No. Yeah.
And the coronavirus is affecting everyone. Like, we had to cancel 2 interviews recently because of that, and so on and so forth. So hopefully, it doesn't affect Mars Horizon here too badly, but who can say?
Yeah, no, I hope it won't. But yeah, you're right. It's such a complicated situation, and it's moving pretty fast as well. And there's so much we don't know about it that it's hard. I think, again, it wouldn't be fair of us to say, right, we're definitely going to launch here, only to find out that we can't for some unforeseen reason we didn't know about yet.
Right. And to top it all off, you've mentioned that you're doing console ports.
Yeah. So the game's going to be on. It's going to be on Switch. It's going to be on PlayStation, and it's going to be on Xbox, as well as PC. So we're kind of, and again, we've been working on all those platforms all the way along. So, and that's something quite key in our philosophy on development, is we want each individual platform version of the game to be its own complete thing that fits that game. So rather than us making it all for one platform and then having to kind of like reverse engineer it and try and figure out how we do things, we're working that out. All four of the platforms we're working it out as we go along, so that the end result should feel each one you play should feel native to that machine you're playing it on.
That sounds like quite a bit in terms of logistics.
Yeah, it is. But we've got a good team. We work hard at our production processes and our planning. I think that's one of the things that, as a company, we've invested a lot of time and money and energy in building our production processes up, and I think that's paying off now. And I think we saw that pay off when we all had to suddenly move to working from home. I think if we hadn't quite invested so much in our production processes, then that might have been a lot more disruptive than it has been.
Right. And now, what are you doing to adapt this game to the different platforms?
Well, I'll give an example of something. So if you're doing a pure PC title, then you might use mouse over a lot to explain things that's going on. So you hover the mouse over a thing, your little box pops up where the mouse is, explaining what that button or what that option is. If you're doing a game on console, you don't have mouse over because there's no mouse pointer. So how you explain to the player what's going on is different. So the best thing is to start out by saying, okay, we want to do as little explaining to the player what each button is. Not that we don't want the player to understand it, but we want it to be as intuitive as possible in that. And we want to create that experience where if you do play it on PC or you play it on console, you're playing the same game and you feel the game. But again, another example of something that's very different, it would be the font size. So if you're playing a game on PC, you're tending to sit maybe, half a meter away from the screen when you're playing it. Whereas if you're playing a game on console, quite often you're sitting 2 meters, 3 meters away on a sofa or on a chair, further away from the TV. So if you're using exactly the same font size, it's really hard to read it. And I've played a couple of games on console where I actually struggle to play it because I have to get up off my seat to go and read the TV, which is not massively conducive. So it's all those sort of things you've got to bear in mind. But we're an experienced console developer. We've done console games before as a company, and I as a developer have done console games for quite some time now. So it's all stuff that we're aware of, and we just build into our process.
Okay. And does that apply to, like, say, power? As in, are you having to do any special considerations for the Nintendo Switch?
Yeah, well, the Switch, I'm sure most people know, the Switch is the lower powered of, the kind of console. So what we tend to do is early on in a project, we get the thing running on a Switch. And so then what that allows us to do is figure out what optimization needs to happen to make that a good experience on Switch. So yeah, there's a lot of optimizing you do to get something on Switch, which means when you're planning a project, you just put a lot of optimizing time into the schedule. Because again, what you don't want to do is just say, well, let's make the minimum we can get away with on a Switch and just make that on everything. You actually want the game to feel right for each platform. So there's a kind of more complicated planning process that goes into that. But there's a lot of stuff you can do as a game developer to optimize things. It just takes time, and you just got to make sure you've got that time.
Right. And also, have you considered bringing Mars Horizon to the mobile platform?
I'm up for it. So we announced a couple of days ago we signed Mars Horizon to a publisher called the Irregular Corp, which is really exciting, and that's one of the conversations that's happened. What other platforms we'd like to see it on? I mean, ultimately, as a game creator, I want people to play our games, and I really don't mind what platform they play it on as long as they're playing it. So I'm very platform agnostic. I play PC games, I play console games, I play mobile games. I just enjoy games. I play board games. If it's a good game, I'll play it. So yeah, the more people that play this game, the better. So I'm always open to other platforms.
Okay. And along those lines, in terms of like computer platforms, is this game Windows only, or is there support for Mac and Linux?
At the moment, the beta is Windows only, but that's a kind of discussion ongoing with the publisher. We'll have to see what they want to go with that, because again, everything we can always we just have to see. I mean, in all honesty, like Macs generally, because we're building a game in Unity, doing Mac stuff is generally a bit easier. Right. Linux can be more complicated. I've used Linux myself as an operating system at home a few times, and it's got a bunch of good advantages, but there's so many flavors of Linux. There's so many subtypes that supporting Linux is hard work. And unfortunately, it's quite a small percentage of the Steam market currently. So there's a big commercial decision that developers have to make in supporting Linux. Although some of our other games, like Chainsaw Warrior, is on Mac, PC, and Linux as an example. So we've definitely supported it in the past. We'll have to see, basically.
Right. And in terms of storefront, is this game going to be Steam only, or is it going to come to like GOG alongside that?
Again, it's a discussion we'll have to have with our publisher. Again, I'm open to. I want people to play the game, so whatever. I think when you run a studio, and obviously I run the studio as well, we have to put more time into that business side of things as well, because as well as wanting lots of people to play the game, I've also got to bear in mind that we want to make sure the game makes money, because by making money, we ensure that we've got plenty of money to pay developers, we've got plenty of money to put into, reinvest back into the game and make more of it. So I'm always open to platforms having our game. My personal philosophy is whatever's going to give us the most people playing it is probably the best option. But yeah, that's a kind of ongoing discussion with our publisher.
Okay. And well, let me see. Petty, do you have any questions at this point?
I know it's called Mars Horizon, but do you have like any plans of going beyond Mars or even beyond the solar system?
Not beyond the solar system, but you can do other missions to other bodies within the solar system. I would love to basically build this game ongoing. I'd love to be a multi-year project where every time we discover some interesting new cool stuff, then we add that into the game. And I'll give an example of maybe how this could pan out. And this is one of the exciting things about working in an area that's related to real stuff. So the ExoMars mission I mentioned, which goes up next year, the reason they're doing that mission relates to an earlier mission that I think NASA and also another ESA one, where satellites orbiting Mars have picked up traces of methane. And obviously methane is a gas that there's two ways you can get methane in an atmosphere. One of it is from volcanic geological activity, and the other one is from life. But what's particularly interesting in the case of Mars, because again, we know Mars has had lots of volcanic activity over the years, is because Mars doesn't have an atmosphere, because it doesn't have the magnetic core that Earth has, so it's not protected from the solar radiation in the same way. Is that any methane that exists on Mars only exists temporarily. The kind of solar radiation from the sun decays it very, very quickly. So where is the methane on Mars coming from? We don't know. So the ExoMars mission is basically about answering that question. Where is this methane coming from? Now imagine that, and it's entirely possible they could. That upon drilling into the surface of Mars, we discover that actually there's life on Mars. There's bacterial life on Mars. Well, what's sustaining that life? Is it a completely new form of life? Is it something else? That might suddenly accelerate missions to Mars to figure out, well, what is this stuff? What can we learn from it? What can it tell us? Does it potentially point to reserves of other materials under Mars that make life more or less likely? In which case, if a whole bunch of missions are shot off from that ExoMars mission, I'd love to get those in the game. And that would just be super exciting to be kind of like tagging along with all these real world missions that are rapidly advancing our understanding of the universe. So yeah, I'm absolutely keen to just add more and more into the game.
See.
All right, and I think that's it from me.
All right. Well, let me see. Have you worked out any sort of pricing for Mars Horizon yet?
No, again, a discussion with the publisher on that. That's one of those tricky things that you kind of work out. But yeah, I think it'll be fair. Let's say that. I think one of our philosophies at Auroch is we believe in like fair play, and by that I mean like we want to make games at a fair price that reflects the work and time and effort that goes into making a game, but that ultimately delivers an experience that's fair within the market to the player. We want to treat our players well, and we want to treat our developers, our team well. And we want, we kind of want the player who pays the money for that game to go, yeah, you know what, that was worth it. Like that was a good game. I got a lot of time out of it. I enjoyed it. I'm happy to give you that cash. That to me is the ultimate aim of those, of exactly where we settle that price point.
Okay. And yeah, I think that's about it for my questions as well. So I think we'll conclude things here. Thomas, it was wonderful having you on the program and hearing about Mars Horizon. I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully your beta goes well. And, things stay on track for you to release your game this calendar year. And yeah, I'm like, so the game is Mars Horizon. It's looking to have its beta launch in, 3 days?
3 days, yeah. So if you go to aurocdigital.com, you can sign up for the beta, and we'd welcome you on board. And yeah, well, thank you both for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
No problem. All right, so that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. As always, be sure to tune in for our Sunday reviews. And until then, I shall wish you good gaming.